Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Top 5 Actions or Inactions that will create legal challenges for you. I know Chief Murphy has some great information to provide to you, but at first I want to go over a couple of housekeeping items. This webinar is being broadcast using voice over IP technology through your computer. If you have trouble at any point in time, our suggestion is that you turn off everything and then turn back on, or log out and log back in, and that should correct it. If you still have difficulties, you can contact support at webinars at iafc.org. Questions during our presentation. We will hold most of the questions until the very end. Once Chief Murphy has completed his presentation, we will be monitoring the chat. If you have any questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat at any point in time. We also like to see who's here and where you're joining us from. So if you want to put that in the chat as well, that would be great. And then also the event is being recorded. You will receive a recording after the webinar. These slides will also be made available to you. That gives you the information on upcoming VCOS opportunities for you to be engaged. We do have the webinar series every Tuesday. Here's a couple of the upcoming webinars. And then also the IAFC VCOS Town Hall with the Board of Directors on May 21st. You don't want to miss that. There's a QR code there that you can scan to register. And once again, there's some IAFC events and then some VCOS webinars coming up. Be sure and check these out and join us for those as well. And with that, I will turn it over to Chief Murphy to share with you the actions and inactions that create legal challenges. Chief Murphy.
Well, thank you very much. Welcome to the presentation today. I appreciate all you taking time out of your busy schedule to listen to me talk about some legal challenges that the fire service is facing. A little bit on my background is on the slide in front of you. So Deputy Fire Chief and Fire Chief retired. I'm actually a new fire commissioner for a fire district out here. I just couldn't get away. And also I'm an attorney and a counselor of law, in addition to over a 45-year period of practicing medicine as a physician's assistant. So which I do a part-time now, being that I'm retired. So retirement is not usually in my wheelhouse. But what I really like to do is to talk about the legal issues affecting fire service leadership and the fire service in general. And then I'm not sure I'm supposed to mention this, but I do a lot of articles for Fire Engineering Magazine and do a blog for those guys, and all about legal issues facing the fire services and the challenge that we face. We're going to be talking about today a little bit about that several of you are going to get sued this year in 2024. I don't like to say that, but you are. And a lot of your litigation occurs from within the department and not so much externally. Most of the lawsuits are federal because they deal with your people in violation of civil rights and the laws that affect us as firefighters and fire service managers. And unfortunately, we're going to lose a lot of them. Very rarely, unless there's procedural errors or the facts aren't in place, or it's a frivolous lawsuit, we have a tendency to lose a lot of those litigations, and which should never actually have occurred in the first place. So when you kind of dissect those cases, you take a look at where the fault lies, and the fault lies in the failure to lead or pay attention to what's going on in your organization. And many times when I represent firefighters in these sort of situations, it's, the common complaint is, I had a complaint, I complained about it, it went nowhere. I jumped over my chain of command as noted in policy, and it still didn't go anywhere. And so I went outside. I went out to the state. I went out to the feds, and then now we're in this situation which should have never occurred in the first place. So I think falling asleep at the switch is not what our leadership should be doing. And we need to pay attention to what the firefighters are saying, the fire officers are saying about these sort of cases of discrimination, retaliation, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. The other part is allowing the status quo to exist, and much of it is sort of the good old boy network that we see in a lot of fire departments, that we've always done it this way, get along or get out. And so, we have our established routines, and this is what is, you're in this environment. You chose to come in. You sort of have to accept the status quo. And in today's environment, the answer to that is absolutely not. And so I think that as leaders, and even as a new fire chief, I know that I did a couple of classes around the country for new fire chiefs, and they were trying to establish a pattern and practice in the organization that, violating the law and shenanigans and pranks and those sorts of things are not going to be tolerated in their organization. And so they just wanted somebody to come in and just reinforce their position from a legal perspective as to, what the new course of action is going to be in their organizations. The other is not knowing exactly what the updates in the law are. And we're going to talk about a couple new updates dealing with pregnant firefighters, gay and lesbian firefighters, and transitioning firefighters, and expressing milk at work under a maternity act called the Pump Act, which we're going to talk about again later. And I think overall, our fault lies in that we don't create a safe workplace for our employees. We work very hard on creating a safe workplace out in the field and on operational issues. But when you come back to the fire station, there has to be a space that's safe for all people in your organization. And your job as leaders and leadership managers and fire officers is to create that sort of safe workplace, which we're going to sort of describe here in a second. This slide is basically, it says that litigation originates from your organization. And the top ones are the personnel issues, the discrimination, the retaliation, negligence. And the last one is theft and embezzlement. And what we see, although we don't see a lot of it, but there's enough of it to be noticeable. And it doesn't reach the magnitude of the ones above, the four little lines above. But, there's a lot of theft going on in an organization. And every once in a while, you'll have somebody embezzling, thousands, if not millions of dollars out of your organization. And I always say, how can you overlook that as a leader when, you may be bringing in a lot of money from property tax and building and that sort of stuff. And, the actual amount in your bank account is not getting any bigger. And so somebody's taking it. And so I think that you as the leader need to understand that we're prone to theft just like anywhere else. And we need to have safeguards put into place to prevent that sort of stuff. But the primary focus is above the four above, which we're going to talk about through this presentation. We do have external causes of litigation, structure fires. We're always, all our primary job is to, fire safety and prevention and life hazards and those sorts of things. Departments still get sued because we may not show up in a timely manner. We may not have enough resources that are there initially. And so people's property get destroyed. And sometimes, and several times, on other cases, I've been representing individuals. They didn't have insurance, and I was as an expert witness, as an example. They didn't have insurance on their property, so they sued the municipality or the fire department for their damages, which really never went anywhere because of the various immunity laws that we have available to us. But still, it creates, we have to defend ourselves against these sort of litigations, and that costs us money and it costs us time, and it's very stressful to get sued. The next one's over there we're seeing is the EMS malpractice. The biggest case right now is that just got resolved, unfortunately, in Aurora, Colorado, is the Elijah McClain ketamine case. Another case for EMS is in Illinois, where recorded two paramedics placed a patient face down on a gurney, and he died from compression asphyxia. So, and there's a lot of other cases out there, missed intubations, motor vehicle accidents, drop patients, those sorts of things. And so it creates, again, a liability burden on our organization where we should have never gone down that road in the first place. And so good training, good policy, good oversight, I think, would prevent a lot of those sorts of things. Apparatus accidents, you're running I always say we're running a 60,000-pound piece of equipment down the road at sometimes breakneck speed, and we run into things. And so I think the latest case, the big case is in Kansas City, where a responding vehicle was told to go code green, which in my lingo is just do the speed limit, pay attention to all the stoplights and stop signs and stuff. Ended up careening through an intersection at speed, and then hit a car and a pedestrian and killed 3 or 4 people. And the litigation is still going on, and the driver is still under a lot of heat, and the department is as well for that particular accident. So we see a lot of motor vehicle accidents that we get sued for. We're mostly at fault because of the fact that we have liability responsibility. Sometimes your drivers are impaired, which negates sort of those insulations of immunity. And so we have to be very careful as how we train our drivers, how they drive, and make sure that they are obeying the speed limits and the state laws and your policies and the organizations. Hazardous materials, we don't see many litigations on those. Usually those are pretty large events. I think the latest one is the train wreck in Ohio, and I think there's been other subsequent train wrecks with highly volatile material, hazardous chemicals. Usually the fire department is underprepared. The local guys are underprepared. So it takes a while for other resources to get there. So there's a collective group of people that are, could be considered at fault. And I know that, property owners several times and a number of times sue the railroad companies or transportation agencies because of damage and health hazards to themselves or their personal property. Then wildland fires, we're seeing more and more across the country. There's the urban wildland interface issues that are occurring as we build into the wilderness. It's creating more of a fire safety hazard for our communities and for the firefighters. And again, it's lack of resources, lack of response, not calling in a timely manner those resources that can help mitigate a wildland fire in your community. So I think a lot of this has to do with pre-planning and just recognizing that as fire service leaders, there's legal issues out there that are operationally based, and so I think we need to be again cognizant of that sort of stuff. And then my favorite slide is, in the absence of leadership, legal issues drive change in the fire service, and that's horribly true, especially as we deal with personnel issues. And people fires are our biggest fires. When I was coming into the rank as a fire chief, I had asked one of my mentors what the biggest issue was that he faced during his tenure as the fire chief. And he said, fires go out, eventually they run out of fuel, but people fires never do. There's always what he called a rekindle of a personnel issue, and it creates, an ongoing problem for the organization. So, objective leadership and, presence and those sorts of things we're going to talk about at the end, I think mitigates a lot of litigation that goes on in our organization. And that's your responsibility as a leader of the organization to prevent litigation. So, our old friend Gordon Graham says, predictable is preventable. So the slide here is the proactive leadership prevents legal mishaps. And I think that's true. I think that as the departments I've been involved in or the departments I've consulted with, proactive leadership prevents a lot of litigation because the leaders know what's going on. They listen, they have good policies in place, and they enforce the policy. So we need to be proactive, I think, in our leadership mantra. And and if you're a new fire chief and an organization that's been around for a while, I think it's incumbent on you to understand what the situations are, and then try to make those changes in order to improve the presence of the organization. So we started sort of at the base here, and we talk about policies and the absence thereof, and creating a good mission and core value statements. And I think that a lot of your organization's actions depend on well-written policies, well-written SOGs and SOPs, so people in your organization know what's expected of them, and then people outside the organization who are sort of looking inward to your organization understand what you're all about. And so policies are your rules, in addition to the the state and federal laws. They're bright lines, so they're black and white. There's no gray areas in there. And then I also put in there, like, they must include off-duty behavior, and what the expectations are when your firefighters are out and off duty in the community or going to conferences or traveling around. Is the expectation is that they represent your organization. And I think under a code of conduct is sort of outlines those expectations. And believe it or not, you can, discipline somebody under the code of conduct under a term called conduct unbecoming. When you're, hooting and whooping it up in a bar somewhere and you get into a bar fight. And trust me, there's a lot of litigation out there on that as well. So I think we need to be very careful as firefighters and employees of an organization, but the employer needs to put up some guidelines or guide rails or guardrails, I guess, for how the employee is going to be acting in both on duty and off duty. The other part of this is that, mission statements are important. Mine is ILTS, I live to serve. I think your organization probably has a more sophisticated one than I do, but I think we need to have a mission statement as sort of as a rallying cry for members of the organization and your community to say, our fire department has this mission statement, which is to protect and serve, or, to whatever it is. So make it sort of short and sweet and snappy, and everybody can jump on whatever your mission statement is. And also have a core issue value statements in there as well. I'm talking about your professionalism, your accountability to the organization and to the community, and those sorts of things. So we talk about, again, the sort of customer service, the Brunacini model of Mrs. Smith, I think holds true today. We're all about the customer and customer service. But also remember that your firefighters are your customers too. And so we need to make sure that we serve our internal customers in addition to our external customers. And then, the dedication to the service and the safety issues for not only you as a firefighter, you as the leader, but for members of your community as well. Career and volunteer organizations, being that this is part of this presentation, that we do have a lot of volunteers in the United States. There are about 26,000 or more fire departments that have registered as providers in the United States. Most departments are either combination. Some departments are career, but a predominant number are volunteers. And so the numbers that we find from out of the Department of Registry and FEMA is that 9.5% are career, 5% are mostly career, 15% are mostly volunteer, and 70% are all volunteer. And so, but the issues are the same. Even for volunteer departments, you can't escape the federal law, you can't escape the state law. And I think that we see a number of cases, not as many as we see, unfortunately, in career departments, but the failure to address personnel issues. There's a sort of this mantra of the good old boy network, where you're coming into our world, you have to fit in, and if we don't like you, we'll do everything we can to get you out of here. And it creates a discriminatory, retaliatory atmosphere, and it's not a safe place for people to be in. So I'm thinking that even though you're a volunteer or you're in part of a combo department, you still have obligations to the personnel that are you're responsible for, and especially under your policies and your local, state, and federal laws. The other part of this is we talk about failure to address your personnel issues, and I think one of the things that is important here is that we see that discriminatory action and retaliation in a department is one of the most litigated items in our service in fire and EMS. And it has the most costly payout, which is not in the thousands of dollars, but it's in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and sometimes even millions of dollars. If you take a look at cases around the country, there's a case in just outside of Chicago that a female volunteer was harassed from day one. 14 years later, she finally files a lawsuit against the department. She wins over a $3 million judgment as a result of 14 years of harassment and retaliation against her. And my personal perspective on that is, how can you have withstood that so long? And why didn't you file a lawsuit earlier? And I think, only because this sort of firefighter reached the maximum amount of pressure she could take. She found good representation, and I think that was important. And she reached out and talked to other people about, what can I do in order to stop this behavior in the department? And we see a lot of that sort of behavior going on in departments that have, people of, people of color, lesbians and gays, people who are transitioning, people that don't look like us, because, predominantly our fire department population is mostly Caucasian, and very few, minorities and women. So I think we're in an environment where we need to start to take a look at how we're going to change it. It's been, 50 years since civil rights have been enacted. There's been a few modifications going on since then. And so for us as an organization and us as leaders, to perpetuate these sort of discriminatory actions is not right. And unfortunately, as I said earlier, we're going to get sued as a result of it, and you're going to lose. And so let's not engage in that sort of behavior. Under the law, we can't discriminate against all these things that we see in front of us. We're going to talk a little bit about gender identity, pregnancy, and lactation. But certainly, we need to make religious accommodations. We need to talk about people who are from different countries that work in our fire departments. And it's not, what it used to be back in the day when, in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Our population is getting way more diverse. And so we need to accept that diversity on a grander scale in our organization. So when you take a look at under federal and state law, we can't discriminate against people based on their race or their gender and those sorts of things. So, I always, when we do our podcast with my other cohort attorneys, we always say, stop the behavior. But, it gives lawyers a life when you violate the policies, because, we're going to be an important part of your life and in your back pocket for several years until you get this issue resolved. The other part is enabling prohibited conduct by looking the other way. And I think proactive leadership and teaching your officers in the organization on, what, hazing and bullying look like, what harassment and sexual harassment look like. And these are entire day classes. So, this is just a skimming the surface here, but we do this, we haze people, we harass people, sometimes we declare that as a rite of passage into our profession. If you can't handle the hazing or the pranking, and then you shouldn't be here. That's a lot of hooey in today's environment. So I know that it goes on. It went on when I came in a long time ago. My grandson thinks I was actually in the Civil War. When we went to look at weapons of the Civil War, he asked me, hey, Grandpa, is that your war? And the guy in the museum was sort of laughing, but no, that's not my war. I haven't been around that long. But I've been around long enough to understand that, these are sort of behaviors that we need to get beyond. And these are the exact behaviors that get your department sued. So let's identify the behavior. Let's teach your firefighters what it looks like, how to report it. Is there a policy against it? Is there training? Have you trained your leadership what to do if somebody files a complaint? And I think your organization is going to be doing very well if you have these sort of policies in place preventing this sort of behavior. The other, let's see. Yeah. So what are the litigation themes here? Well, let's go back one slide. Basically, it's, inappropriate comments, touching, including sexual assault, poorly fitting equipment, especially for female firefighters, tampering with the equipment, which is a basis of some lawsuits that we've seen, where it creates a safety violation for the firefighter. Violence, domestic violence, sexual assault in the fire stations. And then, and again, it's a lack of response by the fire staff, the fire officers, and a lot of it has to do with, looking the other way and not providing enough policy education to say it's okay to report a complaint. If I report it to the lieutenant or captain, what are they going to be doing with it? And so the expectation is it moves up the chain of command and the behavior will stop. And I think that's important to create that sort of safe workplace that we talked about earlier. It's incumbent on leadership to make that happen. Our other issue is that we failed to recognize diversity in the fire service. And like I said earlier, we're not the same as we used to be. So predominantly, they say that statistically diversity is a fact of life. It says that under the statistics is that by 2050, there's going to be no racial or ethnic group that's going to be greater than 50% of the United States population because of, immigration and people coming into our country having, the birth rate is higher. So we're going to see sort of equality or equity, I guess, in the number of whites and minorities and people of color and women. I know that when I was in law school, over 50% of my class were women in the class, which is a good shift, I think. So we're seeing an exponential change in population. My question is, are we seeing that exponential change in your department? So when people look through the window in your department, who do they see? And so what they're seeing is predominantly Caucasian males. The numbers that we're finding that the USFA and other organizations are putting out is that about 7% overall are women, 9 or 10% are Hispanic or Latino, 7% are Black, and then less than 1% are Asian. And so does that reflect your community? And I would assure you that it does not. And so I think we need to have a more active diversity program in your organization that helps to take a look at when people look into your station, what do they see? Do they see your community, or do they see sort of an enclave of, Caucasian males in the organization? So I think, again, it's a leadership issue. Diversity has been an important issue, I think, in corporate world and not in the other world other than the fire department. And they say that diversity drives innovation because diverse groups are more productive because different ideas and different cultures sort of add to the outcomes of decisions. Again, we talked about reflecting community demographics. Many legal rulings related to the diversity issues. There's some financial ramifications. Sometimes communities don't support you if what you look like is different from what the community looks like. I think it's important for us to reflect the face of the community for financial reasons, ethical reasons. Let's hire people in your community that can do the job, or qualified, of course, and can add to that sort of diverse nature of your organization. And we talk a little bit about DEI training and communication trainings. DEI right now seems to be a swear word in a lot of academic institutions and certain elements of our society. But I think, training people in diversity, equity, and inclusion is important for us to create a harmonious workplace. And it's not a bad thing. And I think it's a good thing, but it needs to be presented to your firefighters in a meaningful manner. So the other issue that we're seeing is some upticks or changes in the law dealing with pregnancies. And again, pregnancy has been sort of a protected medical condition. I was going to say something else, probably not appropriate, but it's a protected medical condition. And so it's been on the books since Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And again, in 2002, Congress passed the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, the PWFA, and actually came into play and practice in 2023. And then, pregnancy may not be considered in making an employment decision. So, sometimes employers will ask the question on candidate interviews is for women, are you planning on getting pregnant during the course of your career? Well, first of all, that's an illegal question. Second of all, it's a stupid question to ask. And third of all, you can be charged with a discriminatory act or issue dealing with even asking that what you think is a relatively serious and simple question. But trust me, it's a serious legal question that you don't want to even go around. And then again, if you do have a firefighter who becomes pregnant, you need to be teaching them treating them with some respect. It is a disability, but only temporary. And so when we talk about those things, we talk about reasonable accommodations for the time that they're pregnant. There's a number, again, of cases out there dealing with pregnant firefighters. And I think in the most, well, not recent case, but I think in Davie, Florida, there is a case dealing with light duty applications for the general population in the fire department, mostly men, as opposed to dealing with light duty requests from a pregnant firefighter. So what ended up happening on that case at the end of the day is they had agreed to a consent decree, which is basically nobody admits fault, but they had somebody come in and monitoring their light duty provisions for the city of Davie, including the fire department. So, when the Department of Justice knocks on your door when there's a complaint, you're going to be in sort of deep cover. So, and again, I have to be careful of what I say in these lessons because they're recorded. The other part is the lactation issue. So there's a new law that's been on the books since 2022. It's called Providing Urgent Maternal Protections, or called the PUMP Act. And there's a number, again, of legal cases dealing with mothers coming back to work after delivering their children and needing to either nurse or to express milk. And what has happened is they've been put out into the hose tower in a bathroom, which is unsecured, unsanitary. So the PUMP Act essentially put into play some rules and regulations that departments need to follow when you're dealing with maternity issues, pregnancy issues, lactation issues. And so even under the Fair Labor Standards Act requires you as employers to provide reasonable break time for employees, which they remain on the clock. So they're not taken off the time card while they're expressing milk or breastfeeding their babies while they're at work. And so, and what I usually say is, why take an issue that is going to be at least 12 months long with the pregnancy and, post-maternity issues, and turn it into a 3-year legal case, which is unnecessary. So I think departments need to pre-plan that there's going to be a pregnancy in your organization, and it even affects fathers. So there's a paternity act that allows fathers off on FMLA and other leave provisions. So we need to think about, we do get pregnant, and people do get pregnant, and our employees will become pregnant. And we need to make those accommodations for both the mom and the dad. And let's not turn this into a huge legal case. The other issue is, sometimes people use inter vivo fertilization techniques in order to get pregnant. And that creates another issue, which is too complicated, I think, to go in on this presentation, as it deals with, how do you deal with your female firefighters or even your male firefighters that are trying to get pregnant using an IVF process, because it creates some medical leave issues for those firefighters trying to get pregnant. So without giving an entire class here in the next 20 minutes, look at an article that was written by myself and Stephanie White in Fire Engineering Magazine, talking about these two exact things. And it goes into a lot more detail on how you can work through the process, I think, policy-wise, and accommodate the needs of your firefighters. The next one is when we talk about transitioning firefighters, lesbian, gay, and sexual orientation in the fire service. We've seen several cases on these issues, and these cases basically are, people have a right to choose what they want to be, even after they're born, in either as a male or a female. So we have a number of gay, lesbian firefighters out there. We have a number of transitioning firefighters in your organization, which creates some consternation amongst the more conservative members of your organization. But at the end of the day, there has been some litigation. There's been a Supreme Court ruling in 2020 talking about protecting gay and transgender workers from workplace discrimination. Those laws have been on the books for a number of years. And I think that the Supreme Court has reinforced the fact that as employers, we need to, again, create a policy and a practice. And, how do we deal with gay and lesbian firefighters, or those firefighters that are transitioning? It's important for us, again, to avoid the litigation. It's important for us, again, to avoid the stigma. When I was teaching a class at FDIC on this very topic, there's a couple of members of a fire service from Long Island that said we had this exact issue, and we talked about it. The firefighter who was transitioning came and told us about it. We had a company-wide meeting about it, and everything was out in the open. It wasn't secret. It wasn't clandestine. And so there was a lot of support, for the individuals transitioning, which to me is refreshing. And so I think your organization probably wants to take that same track. And if somebody comes to you and say, "Hey, I'm transitioning," your response is, "How can we help? What can we do?" And I think that the sort of the department-wide knowledge may be important. Maybe the person doesn't want anybody else to know but you as the fire chief. So I think our response to that is, how can we help you? What can we do? And please keep the lines of communication open. The gender identity issues, even the Pope weighed in on it a couple of years ago. He says, "Who am I to judge?" Right? And so that's your question to you. My question to you is, who are you to judge? And so I think that we don't want to single out somebody because they may be identifying as something different than they were born with, or they want to transition. That's their issue. Our issue as leaders is, how do we support this? How do we, because it's going to be sometimes a medical issue, hormonal changes, taking medications, maybe increased sick time, maybe surgeries. And so we need to make a reasonable accommodation in order to accommodate these particular firefighters. And again, not only is the moral argument important, but the legal argument is important as well. So, and again, because of the new Supreme Court ruling, departments or organizations that discriminate against gays and lesbians and transitioning firefighters can amass a fairly sizable fine. They said in their their ruling, it could be up to $300,000 per event, depending on the employer's size. And again, as part of your sexual discrimination or anti-sexual harassment policies in the organization, which you should have and should be updated. And then there are several states with anti-gay and anti-trans legislation on the books, which makes it more difficult for us as an organization to administer policy. But I think working with your attorneys and looking at the state laws, there's a line in there that we can operate safely and with less discrimination if we just use our heads in order to think through these problems and how we're going to address them. And then, my legal advice is make sure you have a good enforceable policy in place, and make sure that your legal counsel is on board with how is he going to defend the organization if there's a violation. And also have your legal counsel provide some advice as to how you're going to proceed through a discrimination claim. And quite frankly, not all lawyers are created equal. And so sometimes your lawyer may be in a municipal, if you're in a municipality, or he's a private practice guy or gal, you may have to seek alternative counsel. And I would ask your existing attorney who could that be in order for us to help mitigate or prevent these sort of events from going on. One of the things that just drive me crazy is social media. And, I always say that social media is not social and it's not media. It's just a rumor line, And so I think as leaders, again, we need to recognize the fact that this is, social media is harmful to our organization on one side. It's helpful to our organization on the other side. So I know that a lot of organizations will have their public information officer or somebody identified in the organization as providing, feed or stories or populate your websites or their Twitter accounts or their LinkedIn accounts or whatever account you happen to be on. But those are sort of controlled information to your community. And so there needs to be a sort of a filter of, who reviews the material and how can we sort of make this beneficial to the organization. Where the harm comes in is when your firefighters are starting to post stuff on their social media sites, which is racist, homophobic, maybe politically motivated, like, talking about city council or council members, these things. And if you take a look at my colleague Kurt Verone's website, there's probably hundreds of cases on social media where people get terminated as a result of their social media posting. So one of the things that we argue, or you guys argue, the firefighters will argue as well, I have a protected right under the First Amendment of free speech. And the answer is, no, you don't. You have a limited right under the First Amendment for free speech. And there's a number of court cases out there, starting with Pickering and the Board of Education, and succeeding cases all the way down to, this past month, where they talk about, using the Pickering rule on, whether it's protected activity, whether it harms the department, whether it furthers the mission of the organization. I mean, there's a test in there that all courts will use, even though the Pickering test has been around for a long period of time. And so always be advised that, yes, you do have a First Amendment right, but even as a firefighter, even off duty, you have a limited First Amendment right. And so I think you need to make sure that that's foremost in your mind when you're posting on your Facebook or your social media accounts. As I said earlier, it can be a career killer. There's a number of firefighters and EMS personnel that have been terminated as a result of their Facebook postings due to the offensiveness of the material in there. Pictures, if you're on an EMS call and there's a dead body or somebody who's been violated, don't take pictures of that sort of stuff. There's about 7 or 8 states that have enacted laws preventing you from posting that material on your Facebook. It's a felony, and not only will you go to jail, but you won't have employment anymore. Certainly, your employer is going to terminate you. So be aware of no posting of stuff that you take on the job on your Facebook postings. And then, and again, if you're copying material, make sure you attribute the material to the original author and don't take that as yourself. So sometimes I'll use my favorite artist, Paul Cohn's cartoons or illustrations in my presentations, but, I don't alter them. I'm a stick figure guy, Paul is more of an artist. And so when I'm using his material, I'll attribute that this is a Paul Cohn's illustration, and not say this is a John Murphy illustration, which everybody knows that'll never happen based on his artwork that we've already seen. So make sure that you're going to be attributing postings, art, articles, those sorts of things to the original author. So don't put that stuff out there. The other issue is cameras. There's been a big push, I think, in the EMS world to put body cameras on EMS providers. The lawyers are sort of, we think it's a good idea, but there's also some HIPAA violation possibilities. And so, we're sort of going around the horn on this one as to whether that's, an appropriate mechanism for recording medical calls and documenting medical or actions. And I think it has, again, it's this double-edged sword. So I think on the one side, it's a good thing because we can demonstrate, the good that we did for the patient or at the fire, those sorts of things. But the bad thing is it can show, some pretty serious faults, which, can all lead to, supporting a litigation against your organization. In the Elijah McClain case, there's a lot of body cameras on the cops. There's a lot of cell phone cameras out in the public. And so the attorneys that were, prosecuting and defending took a look at all the video. What happened when the EMTs and paramedics arrived? What did the cops do? And, hundreds of hours of camera footage is available for the attorneys. And so we want to make sure that, we act appropriately because everybody's watching us more now than ever. And so, and that we don't add to the burden by putting dumb stuff on our social media and probably illegal material on there that will get you terminated. One of the big cases, I think, is we may have forgotten about it, but it's the Kobe Bryant case where the EMTs and sheriffs, I think in Orange County, California, were taking pictures of the wreckage and the bodies and those sorts of things, and then distributed it out on their social media. And at the end of the day, there was a $28 million judgment against the police and EMS, which caused the governor of California to help create a policy that said, no, this is illegal and you should not conduct yourself in this manner. And so they created a policy, but it took them, the embarrassment of taking and distributing the pictures, a $28 million judgment, which is a sizable judgment, trust me, and then the embarrassment of all that sort of stuff. So, and I think the third leg of the stool here is helmet cameras. And so we talk about, people that, want to record things, they put a helmet camera on, or even a camera in their responding apparatus. And so, the question is, who owns that sort of stuff? And the answer is me, right? The department owns everything that you take on helmet cameras or body cameras or dash cams and those sorts of things. That all that stuff belongs to the department, even the stuff that's on your cell phone. So one of the things we caution people not to do is if you record something on your cell phone, don't delete it. There's a sort of a legal term called spoliation, which is a crime. And so if you delete that material off your phone and it's evidentiary for an investigation or a homicide or a murder or a fire death or a motor vehicle accident, death or injury, again, you could be charged with the criminal act of deleting vital information. So don't delete that stuff off your phone. Download it into a department computer. Departments should not allow in their policy anybody privately recording. We want you to, if you decide to record, make sure that you record on department's equipment. And so if they have, and the equipment is so inexpensive today, it's ridiculous not to have one on every apparatus. But we want to make sure that, the recordings that you take for a valid reason belong to the department or recorded on department equipment. So there's no question about you distributing this on your social media site because you think it's cool. And it eliminates a lot of legal jeopardy, not only for yourself, but for your organization. So helmet cameras, body cameras, cell phone cameras, any sort of recording device. Again, the organization needs to have a policy on, what's permitted, what's impermissible, what happens to the material, how do we store it, and it needs to be stored for a statutory period of time or maybe longer. And so there's a lot of little shoes on this caterpillar, as my favorite congressman once said, that could, that help us move in the right direction. But anytime we have a violation of that, it puts the department and yourself in jeopardy. So cameras. The last one is best practices. And so I've been sort of practicing law for about 22 years, I think. Graduated from law school when we actually had one law book. No, not really. But my cohorts have been practicing a lot longer, and we sort of learn from each other, and we teach these classes, in various conferences around the country. And so we talk about leadership and management and legal issues and, how we can survive in the world that seems relatively legally hostile against us. But and the reality is it's not. I think we need to, be cognizant and aware of the rules, understand, what the playing field is, make sure we have good policies, good people, good leadership, good education. And if something goes wrong, then we need to address it immediately and not wait for these things to go away because they never do, right? So like my former mentor said, it rekindles. And not only are you dealing with a fire, but you may be dealing with a conflagration. So we need to be pretty much aware of this. So here's a Paul Combs cartoon. I'm not taking credit for it because it'd be the stick man up there drawn on the board. But anyway, I think as a leader, we need to be involved, right? So many times we need to get out, understand, what your department's all about. A lot of times people are promoted from within, but occasionally we have an outsider that will come in your organization. So they need to walk around. They need to take a temperature of the organization before they make any substantial changes. There's an old management term called management by walking about. The initials are MBWA. And so it's like, get out of the ivory tower, right? Get out, get on the street, drive around, figure out what's going on in your organization, talk to your firefighters, get to know them personally, you know, their wives' names, their kids' names, their husbands' names, their pets' names, you know, where they live, you know, all of that sort of stuff. It's all, you know, shows an involvement, I think, on your part that you're, you know, a true leader. And so, and also keep an open door policy, which I always had in my organization, because you want people to come in and talk to you. And so I think that's important in mitigating a lot of these litigation issues. You want to create enforceable policies. And so what an enforceable policy means is we need to think about what the outcomes, you know, the generation of the policy, why do we make it? How are we going to enforce it? When does it expire, if it expires? And when do we update it, right? So I know that when I was in the department, we had organizations. We brought 5 organizations into one. We had 5 policy manuals that we had to, you know, boil down to one. And every Wednesday for a year was the most painful Wednesday ever in my lifetime, because we went over policy. And some of them were built for one person because they violated a policy. We couldn't discipline them. So they wrote the John Murphy policy on thou shalt not use blah, 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 only because John Murphy used a piece of equipment to do something that was not permissible in ordinary circumstances. But, you know, John Murphy said, well, you can't discipline me because we don't have a policy. And the fire chief made a policy in less than 2 minutes. So, and it stayed on the books for like 20 plus years. And so we threw that one out right away. Not because of me, but there was some other John Murphy, which I'm not going to identify who that is. Pay attention to, you know, your internal staff. Pay attention to people coming to you from the outside. If there's something weird going on in your organization, you need to follow up on that. And like I said earlier, know your firefighters and staff. Create a safe work environment, both externally and internally, because you want people to want to come to work, right? So if you have an environment that's oppressive and discriminatory and retaliatory, who the hell wants to come to work? Not me. And so what you get is increased absences. You get people that are leaving the organization for another one. So there's a constant turnover. And you need to recognize the fact that, you know, there's a problem in your organization, and you as the leader need to manage and mitigate that. Training programs, you know, work with your training division to create excellent programs, especially in communications. We don't communicate very well. And I think what happens is we communicate to respond. We don't communicate to listen and learn. So if you're in a dialogue with somebody, many people are thinking, well, how am I going to respond to this? Well, let's listen first, communicate and respond later. So let's talk about, you know, those sorts of things, and then talk about how do you create a good team. Talk about diversity. If you want to use DEI, that's perfectly acceptable. But there are other sort of, you know, diversity programs out there that you can incorporate into your organizations. And you want to create, excuse me, an environment of mutual respect, because, you know, I may be a male white firefighter. It doesn't mean that I, you know, should not respect a woman and person of color, somebody who doesn't look like me. That's, I think, the genesis of creating a diverse workplace is everybody can identify and recognize and use the talents of people that, you know, don't look like me and don't think like me. So we want that power in the organization to work. You want to walk the talk. So you got to, as a leader, you know, you can't be out there, you know, doing discriminatory things or making snide comments or, you know, not following your own policies. That happens occasionally. And then the last one is have fun. And I'm thinking, how do we do that, right? So many of you have probably the best time in your entire life being the fire chief of your organization or a fire officer. I know that in my 32 years, I moved up the ranks from paramedic firefighter to fire chief in a small community here in Washington, and mostly as the deputy fire chief in another organization that we're contracting with. And it was the best time of my life until it wasn't. And so I think we need to kind of look at having fun while we're at work. You want to come to work, smile, engage, drink coffee, shoot the bull with the guys and gals. But at the end of the day, you're the boss. And so, and at the end of the day, being the boss is fun, right? Is fun. So without further ado, I'd like to thank everyone here. I know that I see John online right now. Welcome, my friend. How are you?
Well, welcome, and thank you for carrying on. Sherry, as a member of the team, pulled you off and got you going. I apologize for being late, but I will tell you, if there's somebody on here who doesn't pay attention, this is some of the best advice you will get from a legal perspective about leading people. And I have some, I'm making notes every time we have presentations. I look at this and I think I just had a phone call yesterday driving back from Emmitsburg to Indiana from a captain actually, who's talking about this discrimination, about the male being discriminated against. You were talking about discrimination, but most of us think about discrimination from a female standpoint. But how does it relate to a male being discriminated?
Well, males get discriminated against too, and there's a number of cases. Again, the case law is ripe with people of Caucasian extraction, myself included, that we get discriminated against too. And some of it has to do with promotional processes. Some of it has to do with we support other members of the organization that may be filing a discrimination claim, person of color or a woman, and a firefighter steps up to the plate and sort of defends the actions of the individual, condemns the action of the department, and they find themselves in the middle of a lawsuit as a plaintiff because they're being retaliated against too. And so, a couple of seminal case laws dealing with other industries like the oil industry. Not necessarily the fire service, but if you take a look through some of the cases that you'll see, your Caucasian firefighters are file a lawsuit based on discrimination. It's not as many as we see with women or people of color, but it's certainly substantial.
Yeah, I had a conversation. This is several years ago with a career captain. Because a couple of his firefighters were griping about the practical jokes that were being played on them.
Right.
It was males, all male company. And this captain, we had a knockdown, drag out argument about how it may have been accepted 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, but it wasn't right. And it's definitely not right today. So can you talk about how not to let practical jokes get out of control?
Well, it's interesting, John, because you and I are of the vintage that we grew up in an environment that practical jokes were the norm. It was a rite of passage for us, and we didn't really think about whether there could be a harassing or discriminatory environment. But I think today, when we take a look at pranks and practical jokes and those sorts of things, it occurs in an organization. I think the breaking point is when the person who's the target. So say you're pranking me, and I tell you to stop because it's, I don't want to come to work. I don't have to deal with your pranks and, sort of, it's almost a hostile work environment. And I tell you to stop and you don't stop, then it becomes more of a harassment and possible discrimination against me or a retaliation against me based on who I am in your organization. So I think, and I'm not going to say don't prank because you guys are going to prank. I think the issue is, when do pranks get out of control and when do they become harassing and discriminatory? And it's the person who's the target or the other person that may be complaining is somebody is standing in the same room with us and you're pranking me and they're offended by it. And so they can file a complaint as well. And that's a collateral issue that has certainly has weight when you're filing a claim or with the department that John Buckman is harassing or pranking John Murphy, and Charlie Smith is over here watching this sort of stuff, and it's just we're in a different environment. So I think I'm not going to say don't prank, but I'm going to say those that are target of pranks, just understand that this is behavior that you do not have to deal with. Yes, it is a rite of passage, but it's not the ultimate rite of passage. And again, one of the things that I just reminded me is that a lot of times people are getting pranked or jokes are being played on are generally the probationary firefighters. And probationary firefighters a lot of times think they don't have any horsepower in the organization because they're like new. And so I have no standing, I have no horsepower, I can't make a complaint against the guy. I can tell you right now that that is not true. And so even though you're a probationary firefighter and somebody like Mr. Buckman here is pranking you to a point where you don't want to come to work anymore or is creating an unsafe environment, you have every right to complain. You have every right to complain.
Well, when you think about it and then think about the pranking that we did, and it still goes on today, is we're actually belittling the person.
Right.
And as you said, maybe once, but if I said, hey, guys, I don't like this, I don't feel good about this, then stop it. That's your job as an officer. Stop it when you are warned by the person you're pranking. So great advice. The last thing you said that I wanted to just get a little more information, because you sort of scared me in that I know the department owns everything. You're taking a picture. And don't delete it. That again, I think that's a key point there. But it's like, okay, so you take a picture of a fire scene, not a medical run, not anything like that. Don't take pictures of inside of houses. You probably know fire departments that have been sued for invasion of privacy because they took pictures of inside houses. But you share pictures of an incident on social media of people in the crowd or people on the property. What kind of liability do you have there?
If it's not you, if not one of your firefighters, but it's a member of the public. So you're a photographer, John. You take pictures all the time. And so as a member of the public, you have a right to take pictures, right? In an area that's not secure or not in somebody's house or in the back of the ambulance. But if you're standing outside the hot zone or you're standing in the press zone and you're taking pictures, certainly under the First Amendment, you have that right to take those pictures. The issue comes in is when I take the pictures. So I'm in the back of the ambulance, I'm in somebody's house, I'm snapping snapshots. I'm violating, their Fourth Amendment rights, a right to privacy. And so we can be charged with the violation of a Fourth Amendment violation because we're invading their privacy. And before, a lot of us have been talking about this. People have been distributing these pictures on their social media sites, which compelled a number of states to put laws into place, making this a criminal act to distribute this stuff. And so there's two sort of, let me regroup a little bit. There's sort of two zones here. So you have the public zone where you as the member of the public can take pictures from anywhere, right? So do whatever you want with them. You have that right as under your First Amendment rights. Me and as a firefighter, I don't have that right anymore. And I don't think I ever did. I think it got pushed to the limits where people are starting to distribute very disturbing pictures of motor vehicle accidents, crime scenes, fires with deaths, the sort of the carnage that we see every day on their social media site for sensual, to make it a sensational sort of depiction of your heroic actions as a firefighter and as an EMT paramedic. And again, your organization should have policy in place that prevents that distribution.
Yeah. Well, and again, it's all about policies and procedures. You mentioned that several times during presentation. Again, John, thank you very much. My last photography story is I was so glad. One of the largest fires I've ever made occurred in late 2022, and I never stepped on private property. So when the insurance companies and the lawyers called me up and said, "Hey, you took some pictures. Can we have them?" I was like, "Well, yeah, you can have them, but there's a fee attached."
That's right.
And if I would have stepped on private property, then that would have been different, because then I could have been trespassing.
Right.
So pictures are very, very dangerous, so to speak. They're very positive in many cases, but they're also very dangerous. So, John, again, thank you very much. Let me just get to the last slide here. This has been recorded. You'll get a link. You'll get a certificate. Fill out the survey, please. John, you had some great information. I'm sorry I was a little bit late, but Sherry, I appreciate you carrying on and getting this thing started. And I hope all those attendees that listen to this today will take a few notes and go back and make sure their fire department is complying with the legal advice that you got today. So thank you all very much. Have a great day. Be careful.